The morning Charles called, Kate knew everything was about to shatter. William's face went ashen as he hung up. "Father wants to see me. Now." The diagnosis was brutal. Months, not years. George, only 11, would inherit a crown decades too early. Charlotte asked why Step-Grandmama Camilla was smiling when Grandpa was dying. Her innocent question exposing the cold calculation lurking behind performed grief. But then something extraordinary happened. As William prepared to become king, as Camilla positioned herself to protect her legacy, as Kate held their terrified children together, the experimental treatment worked. Charles would live. The succession machinery that had been set in motion couldn't simply stop. And now, they all had to navigate this reprieve while Camilla's true nature had already been revealed. The door between their old life and new remained dangerously open. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows of Adelaide Cottage like honey through gauze, casting everything in that particular golden warmth that made ordinary moments feel precious. Kate stood at the aga, stirring porridge with one hand while bouncing Louis on her hip with the other. The 3-year-old had insisted on helping with breakfast, which meant flour dusted across the counter and jam fingerprints on the cabinet doors. "Mummy," George took my spoon, Charlotte announced from the scrubbed pine table, her school uniform already somehow rumpled despite being dressed only minutes before. "I did not," George protested, though the evidence a second spoon beside his bowl suggested otherwise. At 11, he was growing into his father's earnest sense of justice, but hadn't quite mastered the art of subtle mischief. William emerged from the hallway, tie slightly askew, hair still damp from his shower. He pressed a kiss to Kate's temple, breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with the homey smell of breakfast. These mornings felt like stolen time moments, when they could pretend they were just another family, navigating the chaos of getting children fed, dressed, and out the door. "Right then," William said, settling into his chair and reaching for the coffee Kate had prepared. "What's the damage report this morning?" "Charlotte's lost her reading folder again," Kate replied, shifting Louis to his high chair. "George claims he's finished his maths homework, but refuses to show it to anyone. And Louis has decided that porridge is meant to be worn, not eaten." The phone rang. It wasn't unusual. Their days were punctuated by calls from private secretaries, appointment confirmations, the endless coordination required for royal life. But something in the sharp trill made Kate pause, spoon halfway to Louis's mouth. William's face changed as he glanced at the caller ID. "It's Father." The words carried weight they shouldn't have at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning. Kate felt her stomach tighten. Charles rarely called this early, and never during the children's breakfast. She watched William's face as he answered, saw the careful neutral expression he'd perfected over years of public life. "Good morning, Father." William's voice was measured, but Kate caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "Yes, of course." "When?" "I see. No, that's fine. Shall I?" A pause. "Right. Yes. I'll be there within the hour." The silence after he hung up felt heavy, weighted with unspoken questions. George looked up from his cereal, those serious blue eyes, so like his father's, studying William's face with unsettling perception. "Why does Grandpa sound different, Daddy?" George asked, his voice carrying that particular quality children possessed, the ability to cut straight through adult pretense to the heart of things. William's hand tightened imperceptibly around his coffee mug. Something in Father's voice. There had been an urgency there, barely controlled, the kind of careful composure Charles employed when the stakes were highest. "He's asked me to come for a meeting," William said carefully. "Nothing to worry about." But Kate saw through it the way his jaw set, the slight furrow between his brows. In 16 years of marriage, she'd learned to read the subtle signs of his anxiety. This wasn't about a routine discussion or a constitutional briefing. This felt different. "Will you be back for football practice?" Charlotte asked, ever practical. William hesitated, and in that pause, Kate felt the ground shift beneath them. "I'm not sure, darling. We'll see." Kate moved around the table, collecting bowls and wiping faces with mechanical efficiency, while her mind raced. Charles's health had been a concern. The treatments, the carefully worded palace statements about routine procedures, but they'd all maintained the fiction that it was manageable, temporary. What if it isn't? Right then, let's get you lot sorted for school, she said, injecting brightness into her voice. George, find your bag. Charlotte, shoes. Louis, please stop painting the high chair with porridge. As the children scattered to gather their things, William caught her arm gently. Kate, whatever it is, she said quietly, we'll manage it. We always do. But even as she said the words, she felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the weight of responsibility that came with loving someone whose life belonged as much to duty as to family. She pressed a quick kiss to his cheek, tasting coffee and concern. Go. I'll handle the school run. William's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary as he navigated the familiar route through London's morning traffic. The Range Rover's interior felt simultaneously too large and too small. The leather seats that usually provided comfort now seeming to press against him with each turn. Something in Father's voice, the phrase repeated in his mind like a mantra, each repetition adding weight to his growing sense of dread. Charles had sounded too careful, too careful. The kind of measured tone he used when delivering difficult news to the public, when every word had to be chosen for its impact and implication. A red light gave him a moment to breathe, and unbidden, his mind drifted to another car journey, decades earlier. He'd been perhaps George's age, maybe younger, called away from a game of football with Harry, to attend what their father had termed an important conversation. That had been about divorce papers and custody arrangements, about how sometimes grown-ups made mistakes, and children had to learn to live with the consequences. What if it's about George? About succession? The thought hit him like a physical blow. George was only 11 younger than William had been when his world first tilted off its axis. Too young to understand the weight of expectation, the way duty could swallow a childhood whole if you weren't careful. Traffic crawled past Hyde Park, where early morning joggers traced familiar paths beneath trees, beginning to show the first hints of autumn color. Normal people living normal lives, their biggest concern whether to grab coffee on the way to work or what to have for dinner. William envied them with an intensity that surprised him. His phone buzzed with a text from Kate. George forgot his PE kit. We'll drop it off at school after I've delivered the Hurricane twins. Love you. The normalcy of it. The forgotten PE kit. Kate's matter-of-fact tone, the gentle humor about Charlotte and Louis, felt both comforting and fragile. Don't let this change everything, he found himself thinking. Not yet. Please, not yet. Clarence House came into view, its familiar Georgian facade bathed in morning sunlight. But something was different. Too many cars in the courtyard, too many serious faces among the staff. The guards stood a little straighter, their expressions more formal than usual. As William pulled into the designated space, his phone rang again. This time, it was his private secretary. Sir, I've just had word from Clarence House. The meeting this morning, what about it? It's been classified as a constitutional matter. I thought you should know before you go in. William's blood chilled. Constitutional matters meant lawyers, succession plans, the careful machinery of monarchy grinding into motion. It meant the kind of conversation that changed everything, irreversibly. Thank you for letting me know. He sat in the car for a moment, after hanging up, watching the morning light play across the windows of his father's home. Not ready, he thought. George is only 11. Kate's finally found her stride. We need more time. But time, he was learning, was never something you could count on when your life belonged to something larger than yourself. Charles's private study looked like the aftermath of a hurricane made of paperwork. Medical reports scattered across the mahogany desk, constitutional documents stacked beside legal briefs, and in the center of it all, Charles himself, looking older than William had ever seen him. Thank you for coming so quickly, Charles said, not rising from his chair. It wasn't like him. Charles had always been meticulous about protocol, about the small courtesies that smooth the machinery of royal interaction. William settled into the leather chair across from the desk, the same chair he'd occupied for countless meetings over the years. But today, the familiar space felt charged with tension, as if the very air held secrets too heavy to breathe. "Father, what's going on? The staff are acting like we're planning a funeral?" Charles's voice carried a bitter humor that made William's chest tighten. "Perhaps because, in a way, we are." The words hung in the air between them, stark and uncompromising. William felt the world tilt, the same sensation he'd experienced as a child when illness had taken his mother. The sudden understanding that the people you thought were invincible were in fact devastatingly human. "The doctors say." Charles paused, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for one of the medical reports. "The treatment isn't working, William. The cancer has spread more aggressively than we hoped. They're talking about months now, not years." Months. The word echoed in William's mind, each letter carrying impossible weight. "Not ready. George is only 11. We need more time." "How long have you known?" William's voice sounded strange to his own ears, too calm for the magnitude of what he was hearing. "The latest results came through yesterday evening. I've spent the night with the constitutional lawyers, reviewing the procedures. There are things that need to be set in motion, William. Things that can't wait for us to feel ready." Charles pushed a thick folder across the desk. William recognized it immediately: the succession protocols. Updated annually, but never something that had felt real, immediate. Now it lay between them like a roadmap to a future neither of them wanted to face. "I had hoped." Charles's voice cracked slightly, the careful composure slipping for just a moment. "I had hoped to see George grow up, to guide you through the early years of your reign. I wanted to be the grandfather who taught him about duty and service, not the ghost he barely remembers." William reached across the desk, covering his father's hand with his own. The skin felt papery, frailer than it should. "He'll remember you, Father. We'll make sure of that." "Will he? Will any of them?" Charles's eyes, so familiar yet suddenly ancient, searched William's face. "You were 19 when you lost your mother, old enough to carry those memories forward. George is still a child. By the time I'm gone, will he remember the grandfather who played football with him in the garden? Or will he only know the history book's version of King Charles III? The question hung between them, unanswerable and heartbreaking. William thought of Louis, barely 3, whose memories of his grandfather would be even more fragmented. Of Charlotte, who adored Charles's terrible jokes and patient attention to her endless questions. Of George, already beginning to understand the weight of his own future, now facing the reality that it would arrive much sooner than anyone had planned. "The transition will need to be gradual," Charles continued, sliding back into the practical discussions that felt safer than emotional honesty. "There are ceremonies to prepare for, constitutional requirements to fulfill. The Commonwealth realms will need to be notified. And Parliament—" "Father, stop." William's voice was firmer than he'd intended. "Please, just stop for a moment." Charles looked up, surprised by the interruption. "I don't want to talk about ceremonies and constitutional requirements right now. I want to talk about the fact that my father is dying, and I don't know how to tell my children that their grandfather won't be at Christmas this year, or George's next birthday, or Charlotte's school play." For a moment, the mask of royal composure slipped entirely, and William saw his father as he truly was, frightened, tired, and desperately trying to hold together the pieces of a life that was slipping away too quickly. "I'm scared too," Charles admitted quietly. "I'm scared I haven't prepared you well enough, that I'm leaving you to face challenges I should be handling myself. I'm scared that history will remember me as the king who died too soon, who didn't have time to make the changes I dreamed of making." "And I'm scared," William replied, "that I'll never be half the king you've already proven yourself to be." The admission hung between them, honest and raw. Outside, London continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in this quiet room, the future of the monarchy was being rewritten with each labored breath. each trembling signature on documents that would reshape 1,000 years of history. "We'll face it together," Charles said finally, echoing words that would become William's anchor in the difficult days ahead. "For as long as I'm able, we'll face it together." The familiar route, from Clarence House to Adelaide Cottage, had never felt longer. William found himself taking side streets he didn't need, prolonging the journey home as if distance and time could somehow cushion the impact of what he now carried. The Range Rover's engine hummed quietly beneath him, the only constant sound in a world that had fundamentally shifted in the space of 2 hours. Months, not years. The words played on repeat in his mind, each iteration feeling less real and more devastating simultaneously. He'd always known this day would come, had been prepared for it, theoretically, since childhood. But knowing something intellectually and facing its brutal reality were entirely different creatures. At a red light near Richmond Park, William caught sight of his reflection in the rear-view mirror. His face looked drawn, older somehow, as if the weight of impending kingship had physically aged him in the span of a morning. "How do you tell your wife the world is about to change forever?" The question pressed against his chest, like a physical weight. He thought of Kate as he'd left her this morning, flower in her hair, Louis on her hip, orchestrating the beautiful chaos of their family breakfast. She'd built something precious for them, a sense of normalcy within the abnormal circumstances of their lives. Their children knew they were different, of course, but they also knew what it felt like to have porridge fights and lost homework, and mothers who kissed scraped knees better. All of that is about to change. The thought hit him so forcefully that he had to pull over, steering the car into a lay-by beside the park. His hands were shaking, actually shaking as he gripped the wheel. When had he become so fragile? When had the prospect of his destiny become something that terrified rather than inspired him? The tears came without warning, hot and angry and completely inappropriate for the heir to the throne. But he wasn't the heir anymore, was he? Not really. He was the king in waiting, and the wait had just become measurably, devastatingly shorter. Through the windscreen, he watched ordinary people walking their dogs, pushing prams, living lives uncomplicated by constitutional law and lines of succession. A young father was teaching his son to ride a bicycle, running alongside the wobbling wheels with patient encouragement. Will I ever have that again? William wondered. Will George remember me as the father who played football in the garden, or only as the king who was too busy to attend his school plays? He allowed himself 5 minutes of this 5 minutes to be simply a man afraid of losing his father and terrified of the responsibility that would follow. Then he wiped his eyes, straightened his tie, and pulled back onto the road. Kate was waiting, and whatever came next, they would face it together. They had to. The cottage came into view as he rounded the final bend, its honey-colored stone walls and climbing roses looking almost aggressively peaceful in the afternoon light. Through the sitting-room window, he could see Kate curled in the corner of their battered sofa, Louis nestled against her side as she read from what looked like a picture book about tractors. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so beautifully normal, that William felt his chest constrict with a desperate desire to preserve it exactly as it was. But preservation wasn't an option. Change was coming whether they welcomed it or not, and his job now was to help his family weather it with as much grace and unity as they could manage. Kate looked up as he walked through the front door, her face brightening with the automatic smile she always gave him before registering the careful neutrality of his expression. The smile faltered, replaced by the subtle wariness of someone who had learned to read the political weather in her husband's face. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice carefully light for Louis' benefit. "Fine," William replied, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. "We need to talk later." She nodded, understanding immediately. In the language they'd developed over 16 years of marriage, "we need to talk later" meant something significant had shifted, something that required privacy and careful consideration. Louis, oblivious to the undercurrents, held up his arms for a hug. "Daddy! Look! Mummy read me the tractor book, and then we built a fort, and then we had sandwiches shaped like trains. William scooped his youngest son into his arms, breathing in the sweet scent of childhood juice boxes and playground dirt and unconditional love. Did you now? That sounds like a perfect afternoon. Are you sad, Daddy? Louis asked with the devastating directness of a 3-year-old. Your face looks like when Charlotte breaks my toys. Kate's eyes sharpened, but her voice remained steady. Daddy's just tired, sweetheart. Big people sometimes get tired from work. I'm fine, little man, William said, pressing a kiss to Louis's curls, just thinking about grown-up things. But even as he said it, he felt the inadequacy of the explanation. Grown-up things. As if what they were facing could be summarized so simply. As if the approaching transformation of their entire existence was just another item on an adult's endless to-do list. Their bedroom had always been a sanctuary, the one space in their home that belonged entirely to them, decorated with photographs of family holidays and filled with the comfortable detritus of a long marriage. Kate's reading glasses on the nightstand, William's running shoes kicked carelessly beside the wardrobe, a basket of laundry that had been waiting to be folded for 3 days. Now, with the door closed, and their voices necessarily hushed, it felt like a confessional. William sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. Kate perched beside him, her hand finding the familiar spot between his shoulder blades where tension always gathered. Tell me, she said simply. Father is dying. The words came out flat, matter of fact, as if saying them without emotion could somehow reduce their impact. The cancer has spread. The doctors say months, not years. Kate's hand stilled against his back. In the silence that followed, William could hear all the ordinary sounds of their evening, Charlotte practicing piano downstairs, the dishwasher humming in the kitchen, Louis chattering to his stuffed animals in the nursery. Life continuing its familiar rhythm, while their world cracked apart. How long has he known? Kate's voice was steady, but William heard the tremor underneath. The test results came through yesterday. He spent the night with constitutional lawyers. William turned to face her, seeing his own shock reflected in her eyes. Kate, this means, I know what it means. Her response was immediate, automatic. Years of training had taught her to think through implications quickly, to understand the ripple effects of royal decisions. The children. Oh God, the children. And there it was, the heart of their shared terror. Not the crown itself, not the weight of monarchy or the loss of privacy, or any of the hundreds of changes that would reshape their lives. The children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, who had been gifted with a few years of relative normalcy, were about to have their childhood compressed and complicated by destiny. George is too young to understand what's coming, Kate continued, her voice gaining strength as she moved into protective mode. He knows about duty, about service, but he doesn't understand what it actually means. The scrutiny, the pressure, the way every choice you make becomes a national discussion. William reached for her hands, finding comfort in their familiar warmth. How do we keep them children while preparing them for this? How do we explain that everything is about to change? Kate was quiet for a long moment, and William watched her process the information with the methodical thoroughness he'd always admired. She'd been thrust into royal life as an adult, had chosen this path with full understanding of its demand. But their children had been born into it, and she'd worked tirelessly to give them breathing room, space to grow without the constant weight of public expectation. We tell them the truth, she said finally. Age-appropriate versions of the truth, but truth nonetheless. We don't lie to them about what's happening to Charles, and we don't pretend that our lives aren't going to change. And then we face it together. Whatever comes, whatever changes, we do it as a family. We protect them from what we can and prepare them for what we cannot. Her voice carried the quiet steel he'd fallen in love with, the strength that had seen her through everything from wedding day nerves to public criticism to the endless challenges of raising royal children. We face it together, William repeated, the words becoming a pact between them. Whatever comes. Kate nodded, but he saw the moment when the full weight of their conversation hit her. Her composure wavered, just slightly, and she pressed her lips together in the way she did when fighting tears. "I need a moment," she said quietly, standing and moving toward their ensuite bathroom. William watched her go, understanding the need for private grief. They'd both learned, over the years, to ration their emotional responses carefully. There would be plenty of time for public strength and private sorrow in the days ahead. But right now, in this moment, Kate needed to absorb the shock of their new reality. Through the closed bathroom door, he heard the quiet sounds of tears, finally a loud muffled sobs that spoke to the magnitude of what they were facing. He wanted to go to her, to offer comfort, but he understood that some grief needed to be experienced alone before it could be shared. When she emerged 10 minutes later, her eyes were red but her spine was straight. She'd washed her face and combed her hair, putting herself back together with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to manage emotional crises with 3 children in the house. "Right," she said, settling back beside him on the bed. "What do we need to do?" The kitchen table at Adelaide Cottage had witnessed countless family meals, homework sessions, and the kind of meandering conversations that happened when you put 3 children together with fish fingers and vegetables they were determined not to eat. Tonight felt different, charged with the weight of unspoken knowledge and careful parental navigation. George pushed peas around his plate with suspicious deliberation, the way he did when his mind was working through something complex. Charlotte chattered about her day at school, but William noticed she kept glancing between her parents, with the sharp awareness of a child who had learned to read adult moods for signs of trouble. Louis, mercifully oblivious to the undercurrents, was engaged in what appeared to be an elaborate game involving his carrots and a narrative about brave orange soldiers fighting the evil broccoli army. "Mummy," Charlotte said suddenly, interrupting her own story about art class, "why were you crying earlier?" Kate's fork paused halfway to her mouth. William felt his shoulders tense, the careful script they'd prepared earlier suddenly feeling inadequate in the face of his daughter's direct questioning. "I wasn't crying, sweetheart," Kate replied, but Charlotte's expression suggested she wasn't buying it. "Your eyes were all red and puffy when you came downstairs, like when you watched that sad film about the dog." George looked up from his peas, his serious blue eyes moving between his parents. "Is Grandpa Charles sick?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. William felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the weight of knowing that his next words would fundamentally change his children's understanding of their world. How do you explain death to an 11-year-old? How do you tell a child that his grandfather is dying without terrifying him about his own mortality? The memory rose unbidden himself at 8 years old, sitting in a similar kitchen with Diana, asking similar questions about his grandfather's health. His mother had knelt beside his chair, her hands gentle on his shoulders, explaining that sometimes people got very sick and couldn't get better, but that didn't mean everyone who got sick would die. "Grandpa Charles isn't very well," William said carefully, borrowing his mother's gentle honesty. "He's been fighting an illness for a while now, and it's made him quite tired. But he'll get better, right?" Charlotte's voice carried the automatic optimism of childhood, the assumption that adults could fix anything if they just tried hard enough. William exchanged a glance with Kate, seeing his own struggle reflected in her eyes. How much truth? How much protection? "The doctors are doing everything they can," Kate said, which was both completely true and utterly inadequate. George wasn't satisfied with evasions. At 11, he'd already developed the kind of analytical mind that would serve him well as a future king, but made him a challenging child to redirect. "Is he going to die?" George asked bluntly. Louis looked up from his carrot soldiers, suddenly tuned into the conversation by the sharp quality of his brother's voice. "Who's going to die?" "Nobody's going to die," Charlotte said quickly, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. William felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. These were his children, his responsibility to protect and prepare and guide through the complexities of their unusual lives. They deserved honesty, but they also deserved the security of childhood for as long as possible. "Grandpa Charles is very sick," he said finally. "Sicker than we hoped he was. The doctors are working hard to help him, but sometimes even doctors can't fix everything." George's face crumpled slightly, the careful composure he'd been maintaining giving way to childish fear. "But if Grandpa Charles dies, that means—" He didn't finish the sentence, but William heard the unspoken conclusion. "That means you become king. That means everything changes." "Why is everyone whispering?" Louis asked, his 3-year-old brain picking up on the atmospheric shift, even if he couldn't understand its source. "Are we in trouble?" "No, darling," Kate said, reaching across the table to squeeze his sticky fingers. "We're not in trouble. Grown-ups sometimes have to talk about difficult things, and it makes us sad." "Can I hug Grandpa Charles?" Louis asked with the logical directness of early childhood. "Hugs make me feel better when I'm sad." William felt his throat close with emotion. "I think Grandpa Charles would love a hug from you." Charlotte had been unusually quiet during this exchange, her sharp mind clearly processing the implications her brothers couldn't fully grasp. Finally, she looked directly at William, with an expression far too mature for her 9 years. "If something happens to Grandpa Charles, everything will change for us, won't it?" The question was both devastating and perceptive. Charlotte had always been emotionally intelligent, quick to pick up on subtleties that her brothers missed. She understood, in the way that middle children often did, how family dynamics shifted and changed around events the adults thought they were concealing. "Some things might change," William admitted, "but the important things, how much we love each other, how we take care of each other as a family, those things will never change." "Promise?" George asked, his voice small. "Promise," Kate said firmly, reaching out to take both her older children's hands. "Whatever happens, whatever changes, we're a family first. That will never, ever change." Louis, apparently satisfied that the crisis had passed and that hugs had been prescribed as medicine, returned to his carrot army with renewed enthusiasm. But William saw George and Charlotte exchange a look, a silent communication between siblings who had suddenly been forced to contemplate a future more complex than playground disputes and forgotten homework. Later, after the children had been bathed and read to and tucked into bed with extra kisses and extended bedtime stories, William found himself standing in George's doorway. His eldest son was lying awake, staring at the ceiling with the kind of wide-eyed worry that made William's heart ache. "Dad?" George's voice was whisper quiet in the darkness. "Yes? Are you scared?" The question was so honest, so vulnerable, that William felt his careful parental composure crack. "Are you scared?" Of course he was scared. Terrified, completely unprepared for the magnitude of what they were facing. But he was also, he realized, determined. Determined to be the father his children needed, the husband Kate deserved, and eventually, when the time came, the king his father would be proud of. "Yes," he said simply, "I am scared. But being scared doesn't mean we can't be brave when we need to be. Will you tell me the truth about things, even if it's scary?" William stepped into the room, settling on the edge of George's bed, the way his own father had done when he was small, and worried about grown-up things that seemed too large to understand. "I'll tell you the truth," he promised. "Age-appropriate truth, but truth. And if you have questions, you can always ask them." George nodded, some of the tension leaving his small shoulders. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, son. More than you could ever know." As William made his way back downstairs, he found Kate curled on the sofa with a cup of tea and a book she clearly wasn't reading. She looked up as he entered, and in her expression, he saw the same mixture of fear and determination that he'd been carrying all day. "How are they?" she asked. "Confused, worried, but resilient." He settled beside her, pulling her against his side. "They're stronger than we think they are." "They'll have to be," Kate murmured against his shoulder. Outside, the evening light was fading into the soft purple of dusk. Somewhere in London, Charles was probably having his own difficult conversations about mortality and legacy and the careful choreography of constitutional transition. Somewhere else, Palace officials were updating succession protocols and preparing for changes that had seemed theoretical until this morning. But here, in their sitting room with its comfortable chaos of family life, William and Kate held each other and prepared to face whatever came next with the only weapons they truly possessed: love, unity, and the stubborn determination to protect what mattered most, even as the world around them shifted beyond recognition. Buckingham Palace in the early afternoon possessed a particular quality of hushed formality, the weight of centuries pressing down through gilded ceilings and portraits of long-dead monarchs. William had walked these corridors countless times, but today they felt different, charged with the electricity of constitutional crisis barely held in check. The blue drawing room had been transformed into something resembling a war room, though the battle being planned was against time itself rather than any earthly enemy. Constitutional lawyers sat alongside palace officials, their briefcases and documents spread across tables that had once hosted diplomatic receptions and state dinners. The irony wasn't lost on William. They were using furniture designed for celebration to plan the careful choreography of transition and loss. Sir Edward Fitzwilliam, the Queen's former private secretary who had been recalled for his expertise in succession protocol, looked up as William entered. His expression carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that would reshape a kingdom. "Your Royal Highness," he said, rising with the automatic precision of decades in royal service. "Thank you for joining us." William took his place at the head of the table, a position that felt simultaneously natural and utterly wrong. This chair should have been his father's for many years to come. The documents spread before him: accession council procedures, Commonwealth notification protocols, ceremonial requirements read like a roadmap to a future he wasn't ready to navigate. "Gentlemen," William said, his voice steadier than he felt, "I understand we have much to discuss." The next hour passed in a blur of constitutional requirements and legal necessities. Proclamation ceremonies, oath-taking procedures, the complex machinery of modern monarchy grinding into motion with meticulous precision. William found himself taking notes in the margins of documents, writing down details about procedures he'd hoped not to need for decades. "This feels like planning a funeral while father still lives." The thought struck him with brutal clarity as Sir Edward explained the timeline for formal announcements. Everything they were discussing assumed Charles's death, planned around it, prepared for it as if it were an administrative detail rather than the loss of a father, a grandfather, a king who had waited his entire life for the crown only to wear it so briefly. "The Commonwealth realms will need individual notification," Sir Edward was saying. "Each has its own constitutional requirements regarding succession. Canada and Australia have streamlined their processes since the Queen's death. But we'll still need—" "Excuse me," came a voice from the doorway. William looked up to see Camilla entering the room, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. She moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in these discussions, though William couldn't help noticing the way she surveyed the room with calculating eyes. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she continued, though her tone suggested she had no intention of leaving regardless of the answer. "Charles asked me to attend, given my perspective on his wishes for the transition." William felt a flicker of irritation. His father's wishes were well documented, thoroughly discussed in private conversations over the years. What perspective could Camilla offer that hadn't already been covered? But protocol demanded courtesy. "Of course, please, join us." As Camilla settled into a chair that had been hastily provided, William noticed the way she positioned herself close enough to be part of the inner circle, angled to observe everyone's reactions. There was something almost predatory about her attention, the way she absorbed every detail of the succession planning with an intensity that seemed to go beyond widely concern. "We were discussing Commonwealth notification procedures," Sir Edward continued smoothly, though William caught the slight stiffness in his voice. Palace staff, William had learned over the years, had their own opinions about various family members, opinions carefully concealed but occasionally visible in tiny gestures of formality. "Yes," Camilla said, her voice carrying sympathetic warmth that somehow felt performative. Charles has been so worried about ensuring the transition goes smoothly. He spent hours going over these details, making sure everything is perfect for William. The words were appropriate, but something in her delivery made William's skin crawl. Perhaps it was the slight emphasis on "for William," as if Charles's careful planning were some sort of gift, rather than a father's desperate attempt to prepare his son for an unwanted inheritance. "His Majesty has indeed been thorough in his preparations," Sir Edward replied diplomatically. As the meeting continued, William found himself watching Camilla more than listening to the constitutional details being discussed. She took notes, careful, detailed notes, and asked questions that seemed designed to understand not just the procedures, but the timeline, the flexibility within the protocols, the areas where personal influence might be exercised. What is she planning? The thought was uncharitable, perhaps even unfair. Camilla was Charles's wife, after all, and her concern for his legacy was natural. But something about her demeanor, the calculating attention, the way she seemed to catalog information for future use, triggered every instinct William had developed over years of navigating palace politics. When the meeting finally concluded, Camilla lingered as the officials gathered their papers and prepared to leave. "William," she said, her voice dropping to a more intimate register, "I hope you know how proud Charles is of you, how confident he feels about leaving the monarchy in your hands." "Thank you," William replied carefully. "I've been thinking," she continued, "about ways I might be helpful during this transition. Charles has shared so many of his thoughts with me about the future of the monarchy, about his hopes for how certain traditions might be preserved." There it was, the subtle suggestion of influence, the implication that she possessed special knowledge of Charles's wishes that might not be documented elsewhere. William felt his jaw tighten. "I'm sure Father will share his thoughts with me directly," he said, his tone polite but firm. Camilla's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or calculation recalibrating. "Of course, I simply want to ensure that nothing important is overlooked in what must be an overwhelming time for you." Camilla's private sitting room at Clarence House reflected 20 years of careful curation, a space that balanced royal dignity with personal comfort, designed to convey both her elevated status and her essential role in Charles's life. The walls were lined with photographs documenting her journey from controversial figure to accepted queen consort, a visual timeline of persistence and strategic patience. Now, seated at her writing desk with a cup of Earl Grey cooling beside her, Camilla reviewed the notes she'd taken during the morning's succession planning meeting. Each detail had been carefully recorded, not from morbid curiosity about her husband's impending death, but from a hard-won understanding that information was power, especially in an institution as complex and tradition-bound as the British monarchy. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent decades fighting for acceptance, for recognition, for her rightful place beside Charles. Now, just as she had finally achieved the security of being queen consort, time was running out. If Charles goes quickly, there's still time to secure her legacy. The thought came unbidden, cold and calculating in its clarity. She loved Charles genuinely, deeply, but she also understood that love and strategic thinking weren't mutually exclusive. She had learned that lesson the hard way, during the decades of public hatred and media persecution that had followed her relationship with the then Prince of Wales. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a name that made her smile with genuine warmth for the first time all day. Sarah, her sister, and one of the few people who truly understood the complexities of her position. "How are you holding up?" Sarah's voice carried the kind of casual concern that only family could provide. "As well as can be expected," Camilla replied, settling back in her chair. "The meetings today were illuminating. I can imagine. Palace machinery grinding into motion, something like that." Camilla paused, choosing her words carefully even with her sister. "There are so many details to consider, so many ways things could be misinterpreted or overlooked if one isn't vigilant." Sarah understood immediately. They had developed their own language over the years for discussing sensitive topics. Charles's wishes, you mean? Among other things, Camilla's voice carried a subtle steel that her family would recognize. 20 years of building trust, of earning respect, of establishing my role. It would be tragic if all of that were somehow diminished in the transition. There was a brief silence before Sarah spoke again. What do you need? The question was simple, but it carried the weight of unconditional support that had sustained Camilla through the darkest periods of public animosity. Her sister understood that this wasn't about personal ambition. It was about protecting Charles's memory and ensuring that his decisions, including his choice of wife, were honored. Documentation, Camilla said finally. Conversations Charles and I have had about his vision for the future. His hopes for how certain traditions might evolve. Things that might not be in the official records, but reflect his genuine wishes. You want to make sure William understands Charles's complete perspective, not just the constitutional requirements. Exactly. Camilla's smile was sharp with satisfaction. Sarah had always been quick to understand the subtleties of palace politics. And I want to ensure that my role during Charles's reign isn't forgotten or diminished in the historical narrative. After ending the call, Camilla sat quietly for several minutes, her mind working through possibilities and contingencies. She had survived decades of public hatred through careful planning and strategic patience. She wouldn't allow emotion, even grief, to cloud her judgment now. Her next call was to her private secretary, a conversation couched in the language of official duties and charitable obligations, but really about positioning and perception. How to ensure that her public appearances during Charles's illness demonstrated both devotion and strength. How to document her contributions to his reign in ways that would be difficult for future historians to overlook or minimize. Protecting Charles's wishes, that would be her narrative, her justification for any actions that might seem calculating to outside observers. Everything she did would be framed as honoring her husband's memory and supporting his vision for the monarchy. But beneath the public rhetoric, Camilla understood the truth. She was fighting for her place in history, for recognition of her role in Charles's life and reign. The cold smile that played at her lips wasn't cruel. It was the expression of someone who had learned to play a very long game and had no intention of losing now. The dining room at Clarence House had been restored to its Georgian splendor during Charles's tenure, with portraits of previous royals looking down from gilt frames and crystal that caught the light from carefully positioned chandeliers. Tonight, the formal elegance felt almost aggressive in its perfection, as if the very grandeur of the setting could somehow hold back the reality of what they were all facing. Charles sat at the head of the table, his frame noticeably thinner than it had been even a month earlier, but his posture determinedly upright. He had insisted on this family dinner despite his condition, or perhaps because of it, declaring that maintaining normal traditions was more important than ever. "George," Charles said, his voice carrying forced cheerfulness, "tell me about school. How are you finding mathematics this term?" William watched his father make the effort at ordinary grandfather conversation and felt his chest tighten. George, bless him, responded with enthusiasm about long division and football trials, apparently determined to treat his grandfather exactly as he always had. Camilla, seated to Charles's right in the position of honor, smiled indulgently at the exchange. But Kate, sitting across from her, noticed something performative about the expression, as if Camilla were playing the role of devoted step-grandmother for an audience rather than simply enjoying her grandchildren's company. "And Charlotte," Camilla interjected when George paused for breath, "how are your piano lessons progressing? I was telling Lady Morrison just yesterday how talented you're becoming." Charlotte beamed under the attention, launching into a detailed account of her latest pieces while Louis built a small fortress out of dinner rolls. The conversation flowed with determined normalcy, each adult working to maintain the illusion that this was simply another family gathering rather than potentially one of their last together. But children, William had learned, possessed an uncanny ability to sense undercurrents that adults thought they were concealing. "Why does everyone keep looking at each other funny?" Louis asked suddenly, his 3-year-old directness cutting through the careful adult choreography. "Are you playing a secret game?" Charles laughed, genuine laughter that transformed his drawn features momentarily back into the grandfather his children knew. "No secret game, my boy. Just grown-ups being grown-ups." "Grown-ups are weird," Louis declared with absolute certainty, returning his attention to his bread roll architecture. Kate caught William's eye across the table, sharing a moment of parental amusement that felt precious in its ordinariness. But her attention was drawn back to Camilla, who was watching the family interaction with an expression that seemed oddly detached, analytical rather than affectionate. Something calculating in Camilla's eyes. The observation was uncomfortable, possibly unfair, but Kate couldn't shake the feeling that she was being evaluated somehow, that they all were. As if Camilla were taking mental notes on family dynamics for some future purpose. "Charles," Camilla said as dessert was being served, "perhaps you should tell William about your thoughts on ensuring continuity during the transition." The words dropped into the conversation like stones into still water. William felt his shoulders tense automatically. It seemed graceless to discuss succession planning over pudding with the children present, even if they didn't fully understand the implications. Charles looked momentarily uncomfortable. "Perhaps we could discuss such matters privately later?" "Of course," Camilla replied smoothly. But her smile as she said it was different, cooler somehow, with an edge of satisfaction that made Kate's skin crawl. "I simply want to ensure that your wishes are clearly understood by everyone." Your wishes. The phrase bothered Kate, though she couldn't immediately articulate why. Perhaps it was the possessive quality of it, as if Camilla were claiming special knowledge of Charles's thoughts that the rest of his family might not possess. George, who had been quiet during this exchange, suddenly looked up from his apple crumble with the serious expression that meant he was processing adult subtext. "Grandpa," he said carefully, "are you going to die soon?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to all their carefully maintained pretenses. Charles's face went very still, while Camilla's expression flickered with something that might have been annoyance at the child's directness. "George," Kate began, but Charles held up a gentle hand. "It's all right," he said quietly. Then, directly to his grandson, "I'm very sick, George. Sicker than I'd like to be. But right now, I'm here with all of you, enjoying dinner and your wonderful stories about school. That's what matters most to me." George nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with the honesty. But Charlotte, ever perceptive, had been watching the adults' faces during this exchange. "Step-Grandmama," she said suddenly, "why are you smiling like that when Grandpa is sick?" The question was devastating in its innocence. Camilla's carefully maintained expression faltered for just a moment, long enough for everyone at the table to notice the coldness that had been lurking beneath her performance of concern. "I'm not smiling, darling," Camilla said, but her voice carried a sharpness that made Charlotte shrink back slightly. "You were, though," Charlotte insisted with the stubborn honesty of childhood. "It was different from your normal smile. Like when Mummy smiles, when she's angry but trying not to show it." William felt a surge of protectiveness toward his daughter, who had unwittingly exposed something that all the adults had been tiptoeing around. Kate reached across the table to squeeze Charlotte's hand, a silent signal of support. Charles cleared his throat, the sound seeming to echo in the suddenly tense atmosphere. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we could save the serious discussions for after pudding? I'd much rather hear about Louis's bread roll castle." But the moment had shifted something fundamental in the room's dynamics. The careful pretense of normal family dinner had been cracked by a child's observation, revealing the complex currents of emotion and calculation flowing beneath the surface. As they finished dessert and prepared to leave, William found himself watching Camilla with new attention. Charlotte's comment had been devastating in its accuracy. There had been something wrong about that smile, something that suggested satisfaction rather than sorrow when Charles spoke of ensuring continuity. What does she know that we don't? What is she planning? The questions followed him home, adding another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. It was difficult enough to process his father's impending death and his own approaching kingship without having to wonder about the motivations of family members who should have been sources of support rather than suspicion. But children, he reflected, as he helped tuck George and Charlotte into bed later that evening, often saw truths that adults worked hard to conceal. And Charlotte's uncomfortable observation about Camilla's cold smile would prove more prescient than any of them could have imagined. The private wing of the London clinic possessed the hushed atmosphere of expensive discretion, thick carpets that swallowed footsteps, walls painted in soothing neutrals, and the kind of orchestrated calm that money could buy, but couldn't guarantee. William stood at the tall window of the family waiting room, watching ordinary people navigate the streets below, living lives unencumbered by constitutional crises or the weight of crown. Behind him, Kate moved quietly between their children, maintaining the careful choreography of maternal comfort that had become second nature over the past weeks. George sat rigidly upright in one of the leather chairs, his 11-year-old frame trying to project adult composure while his eyes betrayed the fear he was working so hard to contain. Charlotte curled against Kate's side, her usual chatter replaced by an uncharacteristic stillness that spoke to her awareness of the gravity surrounding them. Louis, mercifully, had fallen asleep across two chairs, his small body finally succumbing to the exhaustion of emotions too large for a 3-year-old to process. "How much longer?" George asked quietly, the question he'd been asking every 20 minutes for the past 3 hours. "The doctors are doing everything they can," Kate replied, the same answer she'd given each time, though her voice carried increasing strain. William turned from the window, studying his eldest son's face. "He's trying to be strong for all of us," he realized, with a pang of pride mixed with heartbreak. "Just like I used to do." The memory rose unbidden himself at 8, sitting in a similar waiting room, trying to understand why the grown-ups kept whispering, and why his mother's eyes were red-rimmed despite her bright smile. He'd learned early that royal children were expected to bear their burdens with grace, to comfort others even when they themselves were breaking. "George," William said, settling into the chair beside his son, "you don't have to be strong all the time. It's all right to be scared." George's careful composure cracked slightly. "Are you scared, Daddy?" Terrified, William thought. Completely, utterly terrified of losing him, of taking his place, of failing everyone who's counting on me. "Yes," he said aloud, "very scared. But being scared doesn't make us weak, it makes us human." Kate looked up from where she'd been stroking Charlotte's hair, her eyes meeting William's across the room. In that glance, he saw their shared determination. Whatever happened in the coming hours, they would face it together, as a family. The door opened quietly, admitting Dr. Richards, Charles's longtime physician. His expression was carefully neutral, but William caught the subtle tension around his eyes that spoke to years of delivering difficult news to families who couldn't afford to fall apart publicly. "Your Majesty has been asking for you," he said simply. "All of you." Charles's private room had been transformed into something resembling a comfortable sitting room rather than a hospital ward. Fresh flowers on every surface, family photographs arranged on the bedside table, and the familiar tartan throw from Balmoral draped across his legs. But no amount of careful staging could disguise the reality of the machines quietly monitoring his vital signs, or the translucent quality of his skin that spoke to a body preparing to let go. "There you are," Charles said, as they filed in, his voice paper-thin but carrying genuine warmth. "I was beginning to think you'd gotten lost in those endless corridors." Louis, suddenly shy in the presence of so much medical equipment, hung back until Charles extended his hand with infinite patience. "Come here, my boy. I have something important to tell you." As Louis approached the bed with careful steps, William felt his throat close with emotion. This was it, the moment they'd all been dreading and trying to postpone. The final goodbye, disguised as ordinary conversation. Camilla rose from her chair beside the bed, moving to the window with an expression that managed to convey both grief and something else, satisfaction, perhaps, or vindication. William caught Kate's eye, seeing his own unease reflected there. "I want you all to know," Charles continued, his gaze moving from child to child with deliberate attention, "how proud I am of each of you. George, your kindness and your questions about how things work. Charlotte, your music and your way of seeing beauty in everything. Louis, your laughter and your wonderful stories about tractors." The children gathered closer to the bed, their natural reserve melting in the face of their grandfather's obvious love. And William, Charles's eyes found his eldest son's face. "Your strength and your devotion to your family. Kate, your grace and the way you've made us all better than we were before." Kate pressed her hand to her mouth, tears flowing freely, now that the pretense of composure was no longer necessary. "But there's something else," Charles continued, his voice gaining an unexpected strength that made everyone in the room straighten with attention. "Something I need to tell you all before." He paused, seeming to gather himself for something significant. Camilla turned from the window, her expression sharpening with interest. "The doctors have been telling me about experimental treatments," Charles said slowly. "New protocols that weren't available even 6 months ago. They say there's a chance, not a large one, but a chance that we might have more time together than we originally thought." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and hope through the room. William felt the ground shift beneath him, the careful preparations for transition and loss suddenly thrown into question. "What does that mean exactly?" Kate asked, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "It means," came a new voice from the doorway, "that we may need to reconsider our timelines." They all turned to see Sir Edward Fitzwilliam entering the room with a smile that transformed his usually formal features. Behind him came Dr. Richards, carrying what appeared to be test results and wearing an expression of cautious optimism. "The latest scans show the treatment is working, Dr. Plan," Richards explained. "Not dramatically, but significantly enough to warrant hope. We're looking at years rather than months, potentially." William felt the room spin around him. Years. The word that had been taken away was being offered back, tentatively but genuinely. Camilla's expression was fascinating to watch, the cold satisfaction that had been building over weeks of succession planning, faltering into something approaching disappointment before being quickly masked by appropriate relief. "That's wonderful news," she said. But William caught the slight strain in her voice, the barely perceptible hesitation that suggested the reprieve was not entirely welcome. Kate noticed too, her sharp glance at her stepmother-in-law carrying new understanding. Charlotte, ever perceptive, looked between the adults with the confusion of someone trying to understand why good news seemed to be causing tension rather than pure joy. "Does this mean Daddy won't have to be king yet?" George asked, with the directness that always cut to the heart of things. Charles reached out to ruffle his grandson's hair. "It means, my dear boy, that we have more time to prepare, more time to be together, more time for me to teach you about the things that really matter." "Like football?" Louis asked hopefully. "Especially football," Charles confirmed, his laughter more genuine than any sound William had heard from him in weeks. As the family gradually absorbed the reality of this unexpected reprieve, William found himself standing in the doorway of his father's hospital room, looking back at a scene that embodied all the complexity of their unusual life. His children clustered around their grandfather, their relief palpable as they processed the news that their world wouldn't be changing as dramatically or as quickly as they'd feared. Kate sat beside the bed, her hand resting on Charles's arm, with the easy affection of someone who had truly found her place in the family. And Camilla, positioned slightly apart from the others, her expression carefully arranged into appropriate joy, while her eyes betrayed the calculations running beneath the surface. The future, which had seemed so fixed and inevitable just hours earlier, was suddenly open again, full of possibilities both wonderful and terrifying. More time with his father, but also more time to worry about what came next. More years for his children to enjoy their grandfather, but also more years of living under the shadow of eventual transition. The door between old life and new remains open, William thought. But now we don't know which side we'll end up on. Behind him, he could hear Louis explaining to Charles about his latest adventure in the garden, something involving buried treasure and a very patient dog. Charlotte was already planning a piano recital for when Grandpa felt better, while George asked serious questions about what the new treatment would involve. Normal family conversations, full of love and hope, and the messy complexity of people who belonged to each other, despite everything that tried to pull them apart. But William remained in the doorway, balanced between relief and uncertainty, understanding that while they'd been granted more time, they'd also been given more complexity. The machinery of succession that had been set in motion wouldn't simply stop, it would continue its slow, inevitable progress, just on a different timeline. And somewhere in that knowledge lay both comfort and unease, the understanding that some doors, once opened, could never be completely closed again. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but no longer immediate, carrying all the weight of duty and love, and the delicate balance they would all have to maintain between the people they were and the roles they were destined to play. Together, William thought, watching his family navigate this unexpected gift of time. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. The door remained open, and they stepped through it into whatever came next.